This was a youth culture that was 50% based on music and 50% based on a drug, period. I'm 30. I'm part of this generation who have grown up with Just Say No and Nancy Reagan and all the rest of it. I mean, Just Say No, it just seemed like a joke by the time ecstasy got on the scene.
Rave was driven by a new kind of electronic dance music, moving at 140 beats per minute.
When you take music that is a new frontier and you add ecstasy to the equation, it was limitless.
Repetitive, electronic music sounds wonderful on ecstasy.
The drug combines the effects of amphetamine, speed, with those of a mild psychedelic. You can dance all night and your sensory perceptions are tuned way up.
Anybody who's done ecstasy knows music is tremendously enhanced. It's a sensory enhancer, and we're all about sensory experiences these days.
There are definitely those moments at raves where everyone's out on the dance floor and everyone's just feeling the music, and it's like it goes, and then it's there and everyone's feeling it and you're all united and you feel it with everyone else, and it's just amazing.
This is Frankie Bones. He's a New Yorker who's often called America's godfather of rave. In the late 1980s, he was producing dance records that had caught on with young people in Britain.
If you were hip in 88, 89, and you were from the UK just starting out as a DJ, you played American records. So I'd have on the dance charts 5 or 6 records in the charts at a time. It was crazy.
In 1989, ecstasy had become wildly popular in Britain. It had all but disappeared in the United States. But criminal organizations were now manufacturing it in Europe. Millions of British youth were taking ecstasy and listening to American dance music at huge underground parties they christened raves.
I get a phone call, do you want to come play a party for 5,000 people in London? I'm thinking, 5,000 people, this is insane. Let's go. We didn't get up on stage till the sun started coming up, and it was like 25,000 people at this party. I've never seen, it was just a sea of people.
It was a sea of people on ecstasy.
I remember being on the plane, and these 25,000 people are inside my head dancing around, and I'm like, how the hell could I ever even begin to recreate what I just experienced?
But he did recreate them in warehouses and empty buildings in the outer boroughs of New York City. He called them storm raves.
We never did 25,000 people, but when I did a 5,000 person party, it was the most underground event that the East Coast of America ever saw.
Rave kind of started in the East with people like Frankie Bones, and it started in the West in San Francisco, and then it kind of moved closer and closer and closer to the middle. By about 1993, you pretty much had a rave scene in almost every state in the U.S.
Which meant that ecstasy, most of it smuggled in from Europe, was soon in every state. From the late 1980s to the mid-1990s, millions of people were introduced to ecstasy. They called it the hug drug.
It was fantastic. I mean, everyone was just positive and friendly towards each other. Really quite a world I'd never seen before.
It's an experience with substance where there's intimacy and connection beyond what you have in normal daily life.
People who I never thought I would click with, I click with. People who I would normally not go up to and probably talk to, I talk to.
Just Say No didn't begin to deter this group. This was a growing youth movement that combined dance and drugs and managed to exist for almost a decade with virtually no government response.
The first time I came across ecstasy was in August of 1995. And ecstasy back then wasn't even on the DEA radar. This was something totally new and something totally different. We actually had to educate ourselves and educate our managers and supervisors.
Drug controllers had never seen anything like ecstasy. Positive word of mouth pushed the drug far beyond the confines of the rave scene. In the late 1990s, illegal traffic in the drug exploded.
When I first started prosecuting ecstasy cases, 10,000 pills was considered to be a huge amount of that drug, of the ecstasy drug. Now, that's a drop in the bucket. Couriers bring in 30,000 pills at a time. Organizations bring in hundreds of thousands of pills. The leaders of these organizations are charged with smuggling millions of pills, and it almost seems like each one outdoes the next.
If we're seizing millions of dosage units at a time and we're seeing ecstasy being used all over the country, I have to believe, and my assessment is, that the abuse of ecstasy is rampant throughout the country.
Well, here's the troubling reality that the DEA now faces. Making ecstasy illegal did little to halt its spread. And in the last 10 years, the government has been trying to convince the millions of Americans who use it, and the millions who might, that they are putting themselves at risk.
It is a myth that ecstasy is a benign, fun drug.
This is not a benign, fun drug. Even occasional use or a single use is like playing Russian roulette with your own brain.
In the late 1990s, Dr. Alan Leshner, as head of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, led the government's eventual response to ecstasy.
There's no question that for some people, even a single use of ecstasy is going to be extremely dangerous. My observation is that this drug has been particularly glorified in many different venues. Certainly in the youth culture, it's treated as the hug drug, the love drug. It has all kinds of qualities to it. And in the course of that glorification, advocates for the drug have downplayed the risks associated to it. The risks are real.
This postcard was the government's opening salvo in its war against ecstasy, Your Brain After Ecstasy. According to NIDA, the image on the left is a healthy brain, while the brain on the right, which appears dull and full of holes, is said to be showing the effects of ecstasy on serotonin, a brain chemical that regulates mood and sleep and appetite.
I did the Brain on Ecstasy campaign. I believed that if you could show young people a concrete example of something that substance does to a critical organ in your body, that they would then do the cost-benefit analysis in a more sophisticated way, and they might decide not to try this drug or not to use the drug repeatedly.
Anything that damages the structure of the brain or the central nervous system has to be viewed and used with extreme caution.
This is Dr. George Ricarte, the scientist whose work the government has cited repeatedly in its campaign against ecstasy. In 1998, he published the first study to claim that ecstasy causes brain damage in humans. This research was the source of the brain images on the NIDA postcard. Dr. Ricarte's study, paid for by the government and conducted at Johns Hopkins University, suggested that ecstasy users risk losing up to 85% of their brain's serotonin function. 4 years later, Ricarte published another study paid for by the government. This time he claimed that humans could develop Parkinson's disease from what his study called one common recreational dose of ecstasy, the amount that ravers were thought to consume during one night of dancing. The government's headline, based almost entirely on the work of Dr. Ricarte, was chilling. Ecstasy users risk catastrophic brain damage.
It's a psychoactive substance and, just for lack of a better term, turns your brain into Swiss cheese, cuts holes in it, does permanent brain damage, and it's irreversible from the very first time. So the great fear is that we could have a generation of people that have abused this drug that appear to be stroke victims and can't even care for themselves by the time they reach their 40th or 50th birthday.
I don't think there's any doubt that some people have been scared away from MDMA use by what they've been told. They saw that picture of holes in the brain and they said, okay, not my brain. So I think that the propaganda effort has had its impact. It competes rather poorly, though, with word of mouth. Particularly, again, when there are old users out there saying, no, not as far as I could tell.
I've taken MDMA 100 times. Over the last 20 years, I feel fine. There are millions of people who have taken MDMA and don't obviously look brain damaged. Somehow in our culture, we've developed this belief in science so much so that we ignore the evidence in front of our own eyes.
When I read some of the stuff that's printed by the government these days about ecstasy, I just laugh. I just break